Time, the Middle Ages, a world shaped by fire, steel, and belief. A land divided by class. Lords ruled, peasants served, and knights fought. Kingdoms rose and fell by the sword. Glory was earned in blood. Churches stood at the center of every town, places of worship, control, and daily life. Steel on his shoulder, silence in the hall. Before the crown and the cross stood a man, sworn to fight and serve. Before glory came bruises. Every strike, every fall shaped the warrior within. One gesture, one sword, one vow. A squire became something more, a knight bound by honor. And so begins the rise of a knight who would change history. He was born far from castles, in a village where survival was earned, not granted. His world was small, warmth from the fire, lessons from his father, and stories whispered at night. Sometimes, armored men rode past the fields. He watched in silence, curious, not yet understanding. Discipline came early, sharp words, harsh lessons. Obedience was not optional. The first sword wasn't iron, it was wood, but the dream it held was already heavy. Strength came not from war, but from work. Day after day, calloused hands learned to endure. He learned fear not in battle, but in silence, in the dark, when no one came. Far from the noise, he imagined armor on his shoulders and victory in his hands. He didn't know how, but he knew he would become one of them. And so the boy walked away from home, not to escape, but to begin. He arrived as a stranger, one of many, all hungry for a future carved in steel. Before he could wield a sword, he had to carry them, serve before leading. He watched in silence, how they moved, how they fought. He studied every motion like scripture. Training was brutal, pain was expected, but so was discipline.
Get up! The fight is not over!
He fell often, but each time he rose faster, stronger. He learned when to speak.
Stand up straight, boy, your life depends on it!
It was heavier than he imagined, not just the steel, but what it meant to carry it. The halls were quiet at night, but inside, his mind was louder than ever. He stopped asking when he'd become a knight. He started becoming one. And so the boy was gone. In his place stood something harder, quieter, sharper. They rode in silence, steel on their hands, fear in their throats. He saw the battlefield, not as glory but as death, waiting quietly. Then it began, screams, steel, and a world that no longer cared who lived. He had trained for war, but not for the fear that made him forget how to breathe. He held a dying man's hand and understood that honor bleeds too. He didn't aim, he just swung, screamed, and hoped to survive. Then came silence, not peace, just the absence of screaming. It was called a victory, but no one smiled. He looked at his hands and didn't recognize them anymore. He survived, but something inside him didn't. Before the sword touched his shoulder, he asked for strength, not victory. The hall held its breath. This was not a celebration, but a passage. Steel touched flesh, not to harm, but to mark a vow. He rose not as a squire, but as a man now owned by duty. He was now a knight, but it had cost him everything else. For the first time, others followed his voice. He carried more than his sword now. He raised no banners, yet his name carried further than any flag. They offered no cheers, only silence, heavy with unspoken prayers. Glory came again, but now he no longer looked for it. He buried more friends than enemies, and remembered each one. They called him a hero, but he felt more like a graveyard. He received titles, medals, names, but none erased the weight he carried. Even surrounded by hundreds, he walked like a man alone. He held a piece of the boy he once was, and it no longer fit in his hands. He had risen, but not to stand above, only to see further. Before the chaos, there was quiet. He had come to fear silence more than war. They waited for his word, but he hesitated, knowing what it might cost. The ground broke, the sky screamed, and still he moved forward. In that moment, he wasn't just a man. He was a signal fire in the storm. Every swing could be his last, and yet he struck with purpose. He won the field, but not without leaving parts of himself in the mud. And then it ended, not with cheers, but with silence heavy as steel. He returned not as a hero, but as a man who had simply survived. The shield had grown too heavy, but the silence oddly comforting. To them, he was a legend. To himself, just a tired man. He once stood among armies. Now, he sat where the wind remembered more than people did. He touched the armor, not with pride, but with quiet sorrow. He saw in the boy the same fire, but prayed it would burn in peace, not war. He left behind no riches, only lessons, shaped in scars. He didn't fear the end. He had lived like it was always near. His world had grown quiet, but in that silence lived everything he had ever fought for. He left without a sound, because his story had already spoken enough. He was no longer there, but the silence he left behind said more than words ever could. And as one story ended, another began, because the path never truly ends. Some journeys are written in stone, others in blood, but all are walked alone. To be a knight was never about the sword. It was about bearing the weight no one else would. And in the end, all that remains is the story, and those willing to carry it forward.